My name is Sophia, I'm 34 years old. And until recently, I honestly believed I had a happy marriage. Daniel and I had been together for almost 10 years and married for 7. Like every couple, we had disagreements from time to time, but nothing that ever made me question our relationship. We respected each other, trusted each other, and always talked through our problems. At least. That's what I believed. People often asked us what our secret was. We'd laugh and tell them there wasn't one. We simply tried to be honest with each other and never went to bed angry. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder if Daniel already knew things he wasn't telling me. I'm an architect, and I've loved my job for as long as I can remember. Ever since I was a little girl, I dreamed of designing homes where families would build memories together. It wasn't just a career to me. It was something I had worked incredibly hard for. And I was proud of everything I'd achieved. Daniel knew that better than anyone. Whenever I doubted myself, he was always the first person to remind me how talented I was. If I stayed late at the office trying to finish a project, he'd bring me dinner or send me a message telling me not to work too hard. He celebrated every promotion and every completed project as if they were his own achievements. That's why I never imagined he would become the reason I walked away from everything I had built. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Nothing felt unusual when I got home from work. Daniel was already there, sitting in the living room with his laptop open. He smiled when I walked in, kissed me, and asked about my day like he always did. We had dinner together, talked about small things, cleaned the kitchen, and everything seemed completely normal. Then he looked at me and quietly said, "Sophia, can we talk for a minute?" There was something about his voice that immediately made me nervous. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He just sounded serious. I sat down across from him, expecting him to tell me something about work, maybe a problem with one of his relatives. Instead, he looked straight into my eyes and said something I never expected to hear. "I want you to quit your job." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. "I'm sorry." "What?" "I think you should leave your job." I actually laughed because I thought he was teasing me, when he didn't laugh back. My smile disappeared. I asked him why. His answer confused me even more. "We don't need the money anymore." I remember staring at him for several seconds before replying. "Daniel, I don't work because we need the money. I know. I work because I love what I do." "I know that too." "Then why would you ask me to quit?" He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I just think it's the best decision for us." That wasn't an explanation. It was an opinion. I kept asking questions, hoping one of them would finally make him tell me what was really going on. Did something happen? Was he worried about me? Did someone say something? Had I done something wrong? Every single question received almost the same answer. No, nothing happened. Please, trust me. I'll explain later. Later. Eventually. Soon. Those words became his favorite answers. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. But by the end of it, I understood less than I'd had at the beginning. Then he said something that completely changed everything. "If you decide to keep working, I don't think this marriage is going to work." I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. Daniel had never spoken to me like that before. Not once. I asked him if he was giving me an ultimatum. He looked down at the floor before quietly saying, "I'm asking you to choose our marriage." That sentence stayed in my head for days. Because from my point of view, I wasn't choosing between my job and my husband. I was choosing between my independence and a demand that made absolutely no sense. That night neither of us slept well. Daniel stayed in the guest room. I lay awake wondering what had happened to the man I thought I knew. Was he hiding financial problems? Was he sick? Had he lost his job? Was there another woman? Every possibility crossed my mind. The only thing I knew for certain was that he wasn't telling me the truth. The next morning, he acted as though our conversation had never happened. He made coffee. He wished me a good day. He kissed me goodbye. Before leaving for work. It felt almost surreal. I went to the office, but I couldn't focus on anything. I opened drawings I'd been working on for weeks and simply stared at them. One of my coworkers asked if I was feeling okay, because I looked exhausted. I smiled and blamed it on a bad night's sleep. The truth was that my entire world suddenly felt unstable. Over the next few days, I kept hoping Daniel would change his mind or finally explain everything. Instead, he calmly repeated the same thing every evening. I need you to trust me. I'll explain one day. This is what's best for us. No matter how many times I asked, why? He refused to answer. By Friday, I was emotionally drained. I loved my job. I loved my husband. And somehow, I had been forced to choose between the two. Eventually, I walked into my manager's office and handed her my resignation. She looked completely shocked, reminded me that I had just been offered a chance to lead one of the company's biggest projects. She asked if another firm had made me a better offer. I simply shook my head. It's a family decision. Even as I said those words, they didn't feel true. Packing my desk was heartbreaking. As I placed my notebooks, photographs and coffee mug into a cardboard box, I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly life can change. Just 1 week earlier, I'd been planning my future. Now I was walking away from it. That evening, I handed Daniel a copy of my resignation letter. He looked at it quietly before saying, "Thank you." Nothing else. No explanation. No relief. No promise that things would finally make sense. Just 2 words. Thank you. I wanted to believe everything would get better after that. Instead, things only became stranger. Within days, Daniel completely changed his routine. He started leaving home before I woke up. Some nights he didn't come back until almost midnight. He became protective of his phone, something he had never done before. If it rang, he stepped outside to answer. If I entered the room unexpectedly, he locked the screen before I could even glance at it. At first, I told myself I was overthinking everything. Then, I noticed something else. Large amounts of money were disappearing from our joint account. $5,000, $8,000, $12,000. There was no explanation attached to any of the transfers. When I asked Daniel about them, he simply smiled and said he was taking care of something important. That answer only created more questions. A few days later, I noticed him slip an unfamiliar key into his pocket before leaving the house. It wasn't our house key. It wasn't his office key. I'd never seen it before. When I asked what it was for, he hesitated for just a moment before saying, "It's nothing you need to worry about." Then, he kissed me goodbye and walked out the front door. I stood at the window and watched his car disappear down the street. For the first time since we'd been married, I realized I had absolutely no idea where my husband was going, and for the first time, a frightening thought crossed my mind. What if the man I trusted more than anyone was living a life I knew nothing about? After that day, I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's strange behavior. I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. We had been together for almost 10 years. People don't suddenly become someone else overnight. At least, That's what I wanted to believe. So instead of accusing him of anything, I decided to be patient. For about 2 weeks, I didn't ask many questions. Every time he came home late, I simply welcomed him and pretended everything was normal. Whenever he stepped outside to answer a phone call, I looked away as if I hadn't noticed. I convinced myself that if I gave him enough time, he would eventually tell me the truth on his own. He never did. Instead, the distance between us grew a little more every single day. We stopped eating dinner together because he was always working late. We stopped watching movies on weekends because he always had somewhere to be. Even when we were sitting in the same room, it felt as though we were living completely separate lives. The silence became unbearable. One afternoon, I decided to check our bank account. Again, more money had disappeared. This time it was nearly $15,000. My heart started racing. Daniel had always been responsible with money. We discussed every major purchase together, no matter whose income paid for it. That was one of the rules we had agreed on when we got married. Now thousands of dollars were disappearing, without a single conversation. I wanted to call him immediately, but I stopped myself. I already knew what he would say. "It's nothing. I'll explain later. Trust me." Those words had completely lost their meaning. A few days later, I was putting away some laundry when Daniel's phone started vibrating on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't even look at it. This time, I couldn't help myself. The screen lit up for only a second. All I saw was a message that read, "Everything is ready. See you tomorrow." There was no name, only an unknown number. Before I could read anything else, Daniel walked into the room, picked up his phone, and slipped it into his pocket. Our eyes met for just a second. I don't know if he realized I'd seen the message, but from that moment on, he became even more careful. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts were spinning in circles. Who was texting him? What was ready? Why did everything suddenly have to be a secret? The next morning, after Daniel left for work, I did something I had never done before. I followed him. The entire drive. I felt guilty. I hated myself for not trusting my husband. At the same time, I couldn't ignore every warning sign anymore. Daniel didn't drive to his office. Instead, he stopped in front of a small coffee shop on the other side of town. I parked across the street and watched from inside my car. About 5 minutes later, another person arrived. But it wasn't a woman. It was a young man, maybe in his late 20s. The two of them shook hands before sitting together outside. They talked for almost an hour. I couldn't hear a single word. The young man looked nervous, while Daniel seemed calm, almost reassuring. At one point, Daniel handed him a thick envelope. The young man looked inside, then lowered his head as if he were trying not to cry. I had no idea what I was looking at. When they finally stood up, Daniel placed a hand on the man's shoulder before they went their separate ways. I drove home even more confused than before. If Daniel wasn't meeting another woman, who was this man? And why was he giving him what looked like a large amount of money? For the next several days, I tried convincing myself there had to be a logical explanation. But every new discovery only made things worse. Then one Saturday, Daniel left the house much earlier than usual. About 20 minutes after he drove away. I remembered he'd forgotten an important folder in his home office. I picked it up, intending to call him. As I reached his office door, I froze. He had started locking it. Daniel had never locked that room before. Not once. I stood there staring at the door for several seconds. A part of me wanted to walk away. Another part reminded me that my husband had already hidden enough from me. I searched the kitchen until I found a small key that fit the lock. The moment the door opened, I felt like there was no turning back. At first glance, Everything looked completely normal. His desk was tidy. The bookshelves were organized. Nothing seemed out of place. Then I noticed a locked drawer. For a moment, I considered leaving. Instead, I tried the same key. It opened. Inside were several folders. The very first document made my hands start shaking. It was a purchase agreement for a beautiful 2-story house. The price was far beyond anything Daniel had ever mentioned. Buying. I kept reading. The down payment had already been made. The remaining balance had been approved. Attached to the documents were copies of the bank transfers I'd been questioning for weeks. That explained where the money had gone, but it didn't explain why. I searched through the rest of the folder. There were renovation estimates, furniture receipts, utility applications. Someone was preparing to move into that house. Then I found a photograph. It showed Daniel standing beside the same young man I'd seen at the coffee shop. They were both smiling. Behind them was the very house described in the documents. I felt sick. My mind immediately filled in the blanks. Daniel had forced me to quit my job. He'd been hiding thousands of dollars. He had another house. He was secretly meeting someone. What else was I supposed to think? My eyes landed on a sheet of paper with the property's address. Without even thinking, I grabbed my car keys. I needed answers. The drive took almost 40 minutes. As I pulled into the neighborhood, I realized it was one of the nicest areas in the city. The houses were beautiful. Quiet streets. Large trees. Perfect front lawns. When I reached the address, I parked across the street. The house looked exactly like the one in the photograph. About 10 minutes later, a familiar black SUV pulled into the driveway. Daniel stepped out. A few seconds later, the young man opened the front door. The two of them smiled at each other before walking inside. Together. The door closed behind them. I sat frozen in my car. Tears blurred my vision. I didn't know who that man was. I didn't know why Daniel had bought him a house. But after everything I'd seen, I couldn't convince myself there was an innocent explanation anymore. I drove home in complete silence. That evening, I packed a suitcase. I folded my clothes without even thinking about what I was taking. Then I opened my laptop and searched for divorce attorneys. Every click felt unreal. Just a month earlier, I had believed I was living in a happy marriage. Now, I was preparing to walk away from it forever. I had almost finished packing when I heard the front door open. Daniel was home. He walked into the bedroom, looked at the suitcase beside the bed, and immediately understood what was happening. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he quietly asked, "Are you leaving?" I looked him straight in the eyes. "I know about the house." The color drained from his face. For the first time in weeks, he looked genuinely afraid. I expected him to deny everything. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment and whispered, "I was hoping you'd never find out this way." Those words convinced me that I had been right all along. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the front door. Just as my hand touched the doorknob, Daniel spoke one last time. "Sophia, before you leave." His voice cracked. "There's someone you need to meet." I stopped walking, but I didn't turn around. I stood there with my hand still on the doorknob. Every part of me wanted to leave. I had spent weeks trying to understand Daniel's behavior. I had begged him to tell me the truth. Instead, he had answered every question with silence. Now, when I was finally walking away, he suddenly wanted to explain. I didn't even turn around. "I don't think there's anything left to say." "There is." he replied quietly. Just, please give me 10 minutes. If you still want to leave after that, I won't stop you. I wish I could tell you I agreed because I still trusted him. The truth is, I didn't. I stayed because I needed answers. I slowly put my suitcase back on the floor and faced him. Daniel looked exhausted. It was the first time in weeks that I noticed how tired he really was. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hands were shaking slightly. He took a deep breath. Everything you've seen is real, he said. The house, the money, the meetings. I didn't lie about those. My heart sank for a second. I thought he was about to admit he had another family, but none of it is what you think. I crossed my arms. Then tell me what it is. He nodded. Double quotes. Do you remember the conversation we had last year? After your mother's birthday? It took me a moment, but then I remembered. That night, we had talked about my younger brother. Ethan. Ethan had disappeared 8 years earlier after struggling with addiction. My parents had spent years searching for him. We had filed missing person reports, contacted old friends, and followed every lead we could find. Eventually, there were no more leads. My parents passed away believing they would never see their son again. Even after all those years, I still wondered where he was, whether he was alive, whether he ever thought about us. Daniel looked at me and quietly said, after that conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I frowned. What does Ethan have to do with any of this? Everything. He walked to his desk and opened a drawer. This time, he didn't try to hide anything. He handed me a thick folder. Inside were dozens of documents. Private investigator. Reports. Maps. Notes. Emails. Receipts. Every page was about one person. Ethan. I looked at Daniel, completely confused. I hired someone to look for him. I couldn't speak. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to give you hope if we found nothing. I slowly turned another page. There were reports from different states. Addresses. Phone numbers. Names of shelters. Employment records. The search had gone on for more than a year. You've been looking for him all this time. Daniel nodded. Last winter we finally found him. I felt my knees weaken. I sat down without realizing it. He was living 3 states away, Daniel continued. He'd been sober for almost 2 years, but he was struggling to get back on his feet. He didn't want to contact you because he was ashamed of everything that had happened. Tears filled my eyes. He's alive. Daniel smiled for the first time in weeks. Yes. I started crying before he even finished speaking. For years, I had imagined every possible ending to Ethan's story. None of them ended with him being alive. Daniel gave me a few moments before continuing. I started visiting him. You? What? At first, he refused to talk to me. Then little by little, he opened up. He found a job. He stayed sober. He wanted to rebuild his life before seeing you. Suddenly, every memory from the past few weeks began replaying in my mind. The late nights, the phone calls. The money. Young man at the coffee shop. The house. I looked at Daniel. The man I saw was Ethan. I covered my mouth with both hands. The photograph. The envelope. Meetings. Everything I had believed pointed to an affair had actually been something completely different. The money, I whispered. I helped pay for his rehabilitation program after his insurance stopped covering it. Later, I helped him with rent. When he finally got his life together, I bought that house. I stared at him in disbelief. You bought Ethan a house? Daniel nodded. I wanted him to have a real fresh start. I remembered the photograph again. They hadn't looked like 2 people. hiding a secret. They had looked like two people, celebrating something. I don't understand, I said through tears. Why didn't you just tell me? Daniel lowered his head. Because I was terrified. Terrified of what? Of failing. He took a slow breath before continuing. If I had told you I found Ethan, and then he disappeared again, it would have broken your heart all over again. I couldn't argue with that. I wanted to wait until he was completely ready. So, making me quit my job was part of this. Daniel looked embarrassed. Yes. That answer still hurt. He explained that Ethan had been nervous about meeting me after so many years. Daniel believed I would need time away from work once Ethan came back into my life. He wanted me to be free to spend weeks with my brother if necessary. It was a terrible decision. One he admitted he deeply regretted. I thought I was protecting you, he said. Instead, I almost lost you. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the only question that still mattered. Is Ethan here? Daniel looked toward the front door. He is. My heart started pounding. Daniel opened the door. A man slowly stepped inside. For a second, I didn't recognize him. He looked older. Healthier. His hair was shorter. There were lines on his face that hadn't been there when I last saw him, but then he smiled. I saw my little brother again. Soft. That was all he managed to say. I ran to him before he could finish. We held each other for what felt like forever. Neither of us could stop crying. I'm so sorry, Ethan whispered over and over. I'm so sorry I disappeared. I shook my head. You're here. That was all that mattered. For the next several hours, we talked about everything we had missed. He told me about the mistakes he had made, the people who had helped him recover, and how Daniel had refused to give up on him, even when he pushed everyone away. He visited me every month, Ethan said. Sometimes I told him not to come back, but he always came back. I looked at Daniel. I finally understood why he had been so exhausted. Why he had disappeared so often. Why he had spent so much money. He hadn't been building another life. He had been trying to give my brother a second chance. Later that night, after Ethan left, Daniel and I sat together in complete silence. I owe you an apology, I finally said. He gently shook his head. No. I judged you, and I gave you every reason to. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. I should have trusted you enough to tell you the truth. I nodded. And I should have trusted our marriage enough to ask for the truth before assuming the worst. Neither of us had handled the situation well, but we both learned something that night. Secrets, even well-intentioned ones, can become just as destructive as lies. A few months have passed since then. Ethan is doing better than ever. He still lives in the same house, but now I visit him almost every weekend. Daniel and I are rebuilding the trust we nearly lost. And yes, I went back to work. My former company welcomed me back with open arms. And today I'm leading the very project I thought I had lost forever. Sometimes people ask me what the hardest part of this experience was. It wasn't believing my husband had betrayed Emmy. It was realizing how easily silence can destroy even the strongest relationship. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Love isn't just about protecting the people you care about. It's also about trusting them with the truth, even when the truth is difficult. Because the stories we invent in our minds are often far more painful than reality.